Well, I truly believe that God gave us signs of the resurrection rapture event within nature and the blast of the trumpet call, and potentially what time of year that would be through all of his creation. So I was thinking about the daffodils that I saw in the store. Springtime was the time of year when Jesus was resurrected, and also when those who were also in their grave came up out of their graves after him. So springtime really is a sign of the resurrection and rapture of things. And in thinking about the daffodils being one of the first bulbs that bloom, I was thinking about how they're shaped like a trumpet. They're actually called trumpet flowers, the daffodils, and they're very cheerful and come in many colors, bright yellow and white with peach centers and everything. But this particular flower is considered to be the herald of spring. So what is herald? It is an official messenger bringing news, a person or thing viewed as a sign that something is about to happen. So not only does the season of spring represent coming back to life from the dead of winter, which I talked about in my book to a large extent, but it shows that these flowers, the daffodil is called the herald of spring, and they're shaped like a trumpet. So could this be telling us that springtime is the time of the resurrection of the dead? We know we've looked at Rosh Hashanah and Shavuot and Passover before, but there's so many significant things happening right now that are unfolding that it's really hard to dismiss how it all comes together. And in all my videos that I've been working on, I was originally speaking about the Sanhedrin was going to become the world Supreme Court, and just did a video on the letter that they just gave to Donald Trump, which verified everything I had been saying over the last couple of years. And this was completely stunning that this was taking place. So I wanted to lay out all of the things that are about to happen and show you how all of this is preparing the way for everything in the book of Revelation to be coming about. And dealing with the trumpet of the daffodil at the time of spring when everything comes to life. And it's really one of the first flowers that indicates and heralds spring. It's a sign of something about to happen. And I discussed with you before that I realized, and the Lord had shown me when I was finishing writing my book, that Jerusalem, her ancient monarchy, and her people that played the scarlet harlot against God in the last days is Mystery Babylon, the great mother of harlots. And I said that Jerusalem is the mother of us all because that is where mankind, humanity was created. And that's where we're being drawn back to. But we're supposed to follow behind Yeshua the Messiah because he knows the way to get there and he leads us there. So let's look at what's happening all in a row here. You have the herald of spring with the trumpet daffodils, and you had flower images found on the Shroud of Turin that only bloomed at the time during Passover, March, April, and after that they were not blooming. So this gave Jesus' burial cloth the timing of spring, early spring, mid-spring, Passover, as the time that the flowers were, they weren't just thrown onto the shroud, they were placed specifically in certain places. And I worked with Dr. Avinam Danan. He was the top botanist in the Middle East region, and many of the botany pictures that are in my book came from him, that he let me place in the book for the testimony of Jesus. Now, several things are lining up. Now, I talked about Benjamin Netanyahu going before the UN and holding up that sign that said the New Middle East, and he showed a marker and it went through Israel and it came out in the Gaza Strip on the coastline. This was a week before the October 7th attacks. So I believe all along this was the goal, was to obtain Gaza for putting this port in, which is going to be the Middle East corridor where they trade and do everything by ship. It's going to be a fiber optic cable that Google is laying under the Mediterranean Sea, as well as gas pipelines and oil pipelines, and it is literally going to make Israel, Mystery Babylon, rich in the last days. Now, after all of this has happened, and then when Biden was in, they put in a temporary port, but that's not good enough. They're going to turn it into the Riviera now, according to President Donald Trump. Now, that shows you right there that they intend to bring great wealth through the Mediterranean shipping port. And this trade route goes all the way from India, and it goes in through Jordan and Yemen, I think. It's going to go through all these Middle East countries. It's going to come in through Israel. Their plan all along was to cut off the Rafah crossing that Egypt controlled. Egypt had been supplying the internet for Israel, but they were charging exorbitant amounts. So they wanted to reroute and put in a new Google fiber optic cable that runs through the Mediterranean Sea, choking off the Rafah crossing so that Egypt no longer controls it. And that's really the reason why there's been some conflict with Egypt recently. So the video that Donald Trump just put out shows a gold statue of him, and there was also a gold statue I saw quite some time ago of Benjamin Netanyahu. So that's showing riches that are going to come for Mystery Babylon, Jerusalem, through the India-Middle East trade corridor. At the same time that this is building up, where they are going to bring riches through the Mediterranean Sea, which, by the way, is always the big trade route, and is where King Solomon sent Hiram of Tyre, which was his navy, to go traveling to get all of these exotic spices and peacocks and ivory, and he would bring all of this wealth, gold and silver, and he would bring it back in ships through the Mediterranean Sea. So in the last days, it's going to be the Mediterranean Sea that brings the riches for Jerusalem once again. The Sanhedrin will place a king over them that will reestablish the monarchy and have a king like they had King Solomon, instead of King Yeshua, Jesus. Now, at the same time this is going on, I just reported and was the first to report an original story about the Sanhedrin letter to Trump to create the IDC, which is the International Divine Court, where they want to impose those Noahide laws. At the same time, we have the huge mega churches, and we have the largest television networks full of false prophets, multi-millionaires being led into the strong delusion, into adultery, And their mega millions are helping to create this one world religion. And so putting this together, I had told you that Jerusalem is Mystery Babylon, the great mother of harlots, and that the Sanhedrin was going to have all the religions come to Jerusalem to have representatives from every nation sit in the Sanhedrin building with the Sanhedrin. So that means that they would try cases, and if people didn't live under the law that they want to implement, which also disregards the desire of women, and this is what is the definition of the Antichrist. He's not homosexual. He doesn't care what women want. And all along, this is how they treated women back at the time of Jesus. So we have this one world religion continuing to set up. Of course, we've talked already about the three Abrahamic houses that are the synagogue, the Roman Catholic Church, and the mosque, and how the Pope has been working to that end. Now the Pope is ill, so all of these things are lining up really interestingly. Then to top it off, I had talked about the day that the Sanhedrin would perform the red heifer ceremony, because I found this out and researched it and everything. But before we get to that is Purim, which is Thursday, March 13th, ending the evening of the 14th. So you know in 1 Thessalonians 5:1, where it says, "Now concerning the times and seasons, you have no need that I write you. For you yourselves know that the day of the Lord shall come like a thief in the night." I have important things regarding these topics. The times and seasons. Listen to this. At the time of Purim, on Thursday, March 13th, ending the evening of the 14th, this coming lunar eclipse is called a worm moon. And that is referencing the time and season when the soil begins to warm and the first signs of life return, such as earthworms, beetle larvae, and grubs, from their winter slumber. The total lunar eclipse happens on Purim, March 13th through 14th. It is a blood moon. It's a sign for Israel. So in the worm moon definition is the word, the time and season. And it's a return to life. The first signs where life comes back into things and they come to life and spring forth from the earth. Just like the dead will be resurrected out of their graves and come to life. And those who are alive and remain will be caught up together with them in the glory clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and thus we shall ever be with the Lord. And this is at the time of year, springtime, with this lunar blood moon, which is a worm moon, which talks about the time and season when the soil begins to warm and the first signs of life return. Okay, so if that's not incredible enough, and it landing on Purim, which commemorates Queen Esther saving the nation of Israel, and through her actions and prayer and fasting and crying out to God and touching the royal scepter, we know that, okay, that's happening. Both the lunar eclipse and Purim happen on the same day and night, I guess you say, because the lunar eclipse happens at night. March 13th in the evening, ending the 14th in the evening. So those two things, the blood moon and Purim, are on the same day. Right after that, I had reported that It's possible that the sacrifice of the offering of the red heifer would happen on this special Sabbath called the Sabbath Para Aduma, and that day begins at sundown, March 21st, through nightfall of the 22nd. So will this be the year that they intend to do the red heifer ceremony, because the red heifers are getting to an age where they either have to do it or those cows will be too old to do it. And there has been a report that someone over there in Israel did say that they intend to do it for 2025. And I think it's maybe the gentleman that raised the red heifers. So approximately almost exactly a week after the Purim blood moon is the Shabbat Para Aduma, the potential for the red heifer being offered on the 21st through 22nd. And that prepares the way for the rabbis. I'm sure they're going to be wanting to do the lamb sacrifice up on the Temple Mount again this year. And if they manage to get that red heifer, that prepares the way for the sacrificial system to begin. They do not have to have the temple built to begin it. They can do it on an altar there that they have, that we've seen before, that is portable. So then Passover is coming Saturday, the evening of April 12th, through the evening of Sunday, April 20th. Now, I talked about finding this incredible discovery, and I did videos about it last year, but that Passover evening is literally the Jewish night of watching. And this is when Jesus was arrested. After 3 days, he was resurrected, 3 days and 3 nights. But in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus told the disciples 3 times, couldn't you just watch? Watch, therefore. And then he told them to take their rest, which meant that they were going to die and at some point in the future be resurrected. He was telling them to watch on the night of watching, which is Passover night. Then Judas and the Romans came out to him in the Garden of Gethsemane like a thief. He said, "Do you come at me as a thief and a robber?" He said if you weren't watching, he would come as a thief. Could that be a sign of that happening that night? The lunar eclipse is basically 1 week prior to the potential red heifer Shabbat, the Para Aduma, and that is when the Torah reading is Numbers 19, 1 through 22, which describes the red heifer. It is a reading to be a reminder to prepare for Passover by going under purification with the ashes of this red heifer. And just to reiterate, it's at sundown, Friday the 21st of March through the 22nd at nightfall. So any time in that time frame would be when they would perform that ceremony, if indeed it happens this year. Now, the night of watching is known as Leil Shimarim. It means the night of the watches. And it refers to the original redemption out of Egypt, Passover, and the time of the future redemption by the Messiah, according to their tractate Shemot Rabbah 18. So they even say in the rabbinical documents that Passover is the time of the future redemption by the Messiah. And this night is a vigil for all generations. Matthew 24:42. The Talmud even states, tractate Rosh Hashanah 11:1 says, in Nisan our forefathers were redeemed from Egypt, and in Nisan we will be redeemed. Nisan is called Kodesh HaYeshua, the month of salvation, aka physical deliverance from Egypt. but profoundly in terms of salvation through Messiah Yeshua, who redeemed us by the blood of the Lamb of God, who takes away the sins of the world at Passover. Jesus told the disciples to watch 3 times in the garden, Passover night, and they came to him to arrest him as a thief. And I'm repeating that Jesus said, if you are not watching, he will come to you as a thief, just like they came to him as a thief and a robber on that night, the night of watching for the redemption. And this means that the Lord would suddenly appear and rescue you out of your current situation and take you to safety. The Jewish night of watching, or Leil Shemarim, is a night of remembrance and celebration that takes place after the Passover Seder. So it takes place that night. And it's a time to remember God's deliverance of the Israelites from Egypt and to look forward to the Messiah's redemption. And the night of watching is observed by keeping vigil and remembering the deliverance from Egypt. So the world is really considered Egypt, as we know. It's like our Egypt. So this could be the time that the Lord would come down and give us physical deliverance out of our Egypt. The traditional way to observe this is to open the front door of the house and look out. The Passover Seder is a way to keep the vigil and celebrate God's faithfulness and redemptive love. The phrase Leil Shemarim literally means night of the watches. The night of watching is a time to remember that God redeemed his people by slaying the firstborn sons of Egypt. And it's also a time to look forward to God's final redemption in the coming of the Messiah. The night of watching is a time to cultivate a sense of trust in God. It's a time to remember the struggles that the Jewish people have faced and to look forward to the future. And could it be that these people that refuse to repent, that are mega millionaires in these mega churches and mega Christian TV networks that are involved in all this corruption and idolatry and adultery and worse things, could it be that God is giving them the strong delusion? So they're being brought to the White House to bring everybody there to Jerusalem, because these people are very supportive of Israel and they seem to have zero discernment about the Sanhedrin being the body of the Antichrist spirit. They wanted to remove Yeshua out of Israel, erase his name out of people's emails. They wanted to put a bill through 2 of the Sanhedrin members that are in the Knesset, and Benjamin Netanyahu blocked it. But I believe that they will try to pass this when they gain more power, when and if President Trump approves of the International Divine Court, and that helps to place them in charge. All Israel was told to keep the vigil for generations to come, to keep watch. And they saw this as meaning that they should be watching for what great thing that God will do next. Passover is also referred to as a night of vigil, of keeping watch. Passover begins with the setting of the sun, as all days do with the Hebrew calendar. And as the feast day begins, people are mindful of the need to watch for what God will be doing through the night and in the day ahead. The traditional way to observe this command is to open the front door of the house and look out to show that you're standing alert. Typically, one of the children opened the door to see if Elijah is there, because Malachi says that he will come before the Messiah. Now we know that the Lord is going to send Moses and Elijah, the 2 witnesses, to testify. They were witnesses of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. And that's why they're the 2 witnesses. And they're coming to tell this Sanhedrin ultra-Orthodox group about the eternal blood covenant testimony with many that Yeshua made with them. But they're going to fight against the Lamb because they have the Antichrist spirit. and their king will sit upon the throne of David as a replacement king. These are things that the Lord revealed to me that I'm just replaying out of my videos that I did about these. These are original revelations. And so I'm just putting it all together here. And in Malachi 3:1, it actually says, "See, I will send my messenger who will prepare the way before me, and then suddenly the Lord you are seeking will come to his temple. The messenger of the covenant whom you desire will come, says the Lord Almighty. See, I will send you the prophet Elijah before that great and dreadful day of the Lord comes." And of course, that pertained to John the Baptist, who fulfilled his role being in the spirit and power of Elijah. Yeshua, Jesus, really did complete his mission of dying for our sins on the very day that they were looking for their Redeemer to come. Late at night, just hours after the Passover meal, Jesus was arrested in the garden, and in the wee hours he stood trial. And before the next day had fully begun, he was being led out to death. And Jesus' words to his disciples in Matthew 26:40 take on special meaning. Could you not keep watch with me for just 1 hour? Now, I was talking about Dr. Avinoam Danon, the foremost botanist that passed away. He was emeritus professor at the Hebrew University, who gave me the beautiful botanical pictures that are in my book, The Almond Tree, Aaron's Rod, the Messiah King of Israel. We corresponded quite a bit, and we were going to trade books when mine was finally finished. And just before that could happen, he passed away. He helped identify with Dr. Alan Wanger images or impressions of bouquets of flowers once placed on the shroud. Israeli botanist Avinoam Danon determined that the celebrated relic originated in the land of Israel, and that these flowers bloomed at the time of spring, which is the time where everything, like the worm moon, shows that the earth is moved and things return to life. And this is the time when Jesus was resurrected and came out of the tomb, having been dead. A great deal of mystery surrounds the 4.3 by 1.1 meter piece of linen kept in the Cathedral of San Giovanni Battista in Turin, Italy. This was an article written by Dr. Danon, and since he was my friend, I'm reading this. And this piece of cloth, known as the Shroud of Turin, is one of the most important Christian relics in the world. On it is a full-scale imprint of the body of a man, resembling the descriptions of the crucified Jesus that were common from the 3rd century onward. The impression of the body in the shroud shows signs of flagellation, and it appears that the dead man's hands were wounded and bloody. Marks of blood can also be seen on parts of the shroud that lay on his nape and forehead. Consequently, there are many who believe that the Shroud of Turin was wrapped around the body of Jesus after it was taken down from the cross, and that the profile on the shroud is that of Jesus himself. Now, these flowers only bloom in that time frame in Israel, in the Jerusalem area, around the time of March, April, which is the Passover. This helps to date that. The Shroud of Turin is first mentioned in the 14th century when, according to the commonly accepted versions of its history, it was discovered in the vaults of Geoffrey de Chauny. Presumably it was taken there after having been removed from a church in Constantinople. Well, that's the Hagia Sophia Church. They also had the Church of the Disciples there, which I wrote all about this in my book in depth, but that was sacked during the Crusades, and they think it was taken from the Hagia Sophia during a crusade aimed at bringing the shroud to France. Margarita, granddaughter of de Chauny, handed the shroud over to Louis, Duke of Savoy, in 1453, though it's unclear why she was willing to part with such a valuable item. Legend has it that her horse, after having the shroud loaded on its back, refused to move. To this day, the Duke's family is the legal owner of the shroud. Experts in the natural sciences began examining the shroud toward the end of the 19th century. Among their findings were the imprints of plants and grains of pollen and flowers. In 1995, Avinome was asked by Dr. Alan Wanger and his wife Mary of Durham, North Carolina, to assist them in identifying the plants and to evaluate the identification of the grains of pollen that had been collected by the Swiss crime expert Dr. Max Frey. 10 years previously, in 1985, Dr. Wanger was looking at a photograph of the shroud taken in 1931 when he noticed the faint outline of a flower, later identified in the inflorescence of the crown chrysanthemum. Don't you think that they would use a flower called a crown chrysanthemum for the King of Kings, for someone who was a king? And that's why I think that the daffodils heralding spring and the resurrection to life is very significant to the time we're about to enter. Intrigued, the Wangers, amateur photographers, spent thousands of subsequent hours looking at photographs that had been specially enhanced so that the faint images stood out more clearly. They discovered hundreds of flowers, mostly in the vicinity of the figure's head. Comparing the flowers they found with drawings in Michael Zohori and Naomi Feinbrun's Flora Palestina, they succeeded in identifying 28 species of plants. And by the way, daffodils were not an image that they found on the shroud, just to be clear. I'm just talking about how they're shaped like a trumpet. And the Lord's going to send from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and the trumpet call of God, or the trump of God, and the dead in Messiah will rise first. That's because the ground is moved at the time of the worm moon, so that life can come up from the ground. During the Wanger stay in Israel in September 1995, I recognized images of the crown chrysanthemum and the rock rose, known as Cistus criticus, in their photographs, and became convinced that the material was authentic and that the Wangers' findings were valid. At their request, I collected pollen grains of the plants that they had identified so that they could be compared to the pollens that Max Frey had removed from the shroud by means of adhesive tape. In February of 1997, Dr. Avinome Dannon, visited the Wangers in their home and examined the images of the flowers in the original photographs of 1931. And indeed, the crown chrysanthemum was the easiest species to identify there. It took me some time to get used to the visual medium, but eventually I discovered the most interesting find on the site, a bouquet composed of bean caper plants, Zygophilium demosum. And the Wangers had noticed that there were images of flowers and leaves on that part of the shroud, but had not identified the species. It was after I discovered the images of both summer and young winter leaves of the Zygophilium demosum that I became interested in ascertaining that the provenance of the shroud was the Holy Land. During rainy winters, this species sprouts leaves whose petioles look like sausages with two leaflets at their head. When summer comes, the leaflets drop and only the petiole is left. The petioles shrink slowly during the summer, only to fill out and grow new leaves again with the arrival of winter. The only species of Zygophilium that exhibits this behavior is Zygophilium demosum. A bouquet of rock rose, which I had noted along with the crown chrysanthemum in 1995, appears on the right cheek of the human profile on the shroud. Dr. Frey had placed his adhesive tape number 6BD at that spot and actually found some grains of rock rose pollen, long before anyone had discovered images of the plant on the shroud. The fact that the existence of this plant's image on the shroud has been demonstrated by 2 independent botanical methods proves beyond a reasonable doubt that the plants of this species were placed on the shroud at one time. And in 1973, some clerics in Turin had asked police crime expert Dr. Max Frey to examine the shroud with a microscope and to apply to it the method he had developed to study crimes for the purpose of determining its origins. Among the flax fibers of which the shroud is made, Frey found dust particles, parts of plants, and grains of pollen. He placed strips of transparent adhesive tape on the shroud, folding them over, taking the samples in order to prevent contamination. An expert on the flora of Central Europe, Frey had trouble identifying the pollen. He made several trips to Israel to collect plant samples from the Jerusalem and Dead Sea areas. With their help, he succeeded in identifying 25 species of plants whose pollen he had found on the shroud. The Wanger's alternative method of identification confirmed Frey's findings. Dr. Frey collected hundreds of pollen grains from the shroud, but he died in 1982 before he could finish examining and publishing his findings. Part of his collection was studied by the American Paul Maloney, who found hundreds of pollen grains on the adhesive tapes. On tape number 4BD, for example, no less than 45 shreds of plant parts were found, including a whole anther full of pollen. Maloney is not a botanist, but he managed to record tens of pollen grains. Today, his collection is kept in a vault in the care of the Wangers, and his findings are being documented during the latest microscopic methods. Well, I think that they may have passed away, but this was written before they died. I collected samples from Israel of the pollens of all 28 species identified on the shroud so they could be compared to the grains on Frey's adhesive tapes. And in addition, I gathered samples of related species belonging to the same genus or family to be used in cases of doubt concerning the identification of the plants. I hope that Dr. Uri Baruch, an expert on the pollen of Israel and the surrounding area who has joined our research team, will help us reveal the secrets of the pollen grains on the shroud. I also checked the distribution pattern in Israel of the plants that had already been identified on the shroud. In my database on local plant distribution, designed by Barak Dan and his son, data is organized in topographical squares of 5 kilometers to a side. The database includes more than 90,000 units of information, including the names of the plants and the squares in which they appear. I asked Barak to correlate 26 of the species whose imprints were found on the shroud with the plant lists on the various squares superimposed on the country. We discovered that there is one square of 10 kilometers to a side that contains 70% of the species we were seeking, and it is located midway between Jerusalem and Jericho. Another check determined that 5 of the 5 kilometer sided squares containing 27 out of the 28 species are in the Jerusalem area. One includes the villages of Aminadav and Mevo Batar. 2 include the eastern and western sections of Jerusalem. Another includes the village of Kfar Adumim, and the last includes the ruins of Qumran. Other combinations of squares will be examined in the future. As far as establishing the shroud's provenance, Zygophyllum demosum is the most significant plant on the list. Max Frey identified pollen grains of this species on the adhesive tapes that he examined. The northernmost extent of the distribution of this plant in the world coincides with the line between Jericho and the sea level marker on the road leading from Jerusalem to Jericho. As Zygophyllum demosum grows only in Israel, Jordan, and Sinai, its appearance helps to definitely limit the shroud's place of origin. The fact that the images of winter leaves appear on the shroud together with the previous year's petioles indicates that the plant was picked in spring. Woo! Doesn't that give you the chills? This conclusion is reinforced by the state of growth of the other plants whose images are to be found on the shroud. Research on the Shroud of Turin is far from over, and the identity of the man it once enfolded remains unresolved. Not in my mind. I hope, however, that the comprehensive study of the pollen and plant images on the shroud leads to full agreement, at least, about where it originated. The best explanation for the appearance of the plant images on the Shroud of Turin is the one proffered by physics teacher Oswald Schurman, who noticed the images on it in 1983 and conducted many unpublished experiments on the phenomenon of the coronal discharge. Now, this was something I talked about in my book about how the image came on the shroud. And he's talking about the plant images, which involves the discharge of radiation from a surface charged with static electricity. And if you go to my book, The Almond Tree, Aaron's Rod, the Messiah, King of Israel, you can read all about that topic. And this was something that I was writing from what the Lord had revealed, and things just opened up and exposed themselves, and it wasn't from anything that I had read. So it kind of goes in line of that. And actually, Dr. Petra Soons gave me the 5-star review of my book that created the 3D shroud image from the information that was encoded on the linen cloth. He gave me a 5-star review, and he loved my book, and his wife read my book, and he loved the part where I talked about how the image was formed. And that after the book was published, there were things that came out about it afterwards from scientists that corresponded to what the Lord had shown me in my own searching for the Lord and the things of God and his resurrection. And it says, flat objects like leaves lose electrons under their edges when they touch cloth, for instance, forming a dark line that follows the contours of the points of contact. The images are sharply defined where the body touched the cloth and fuzzy where it did not. The Wangers discovered images of other objects on the shroud. Now, Barry Schwartz did not exactly agree with some of the things they claimed that they found, but they claimed some pretty outrageous things that they saw, including a nail, a hammer, a broom, a rope, reminiscent of ropes found in Nahal, Kamar, where ages were estimated to 8,000 to 9,000 years, a round wreath of thorns, a reed, and a sponge. The reed and the sponge recall the description of the crucifixion in the New Testament. And one bystander ran and, filling a sponge full of vinegar, put it on the reed and gave it to him to drink. So in his creation, he showed us through the trumpet flowers of the daffodils, first to flower in spring, heralding the time that this worm moon is coming, where the ground is disturbed and things emerge and come to life, just like the resurrection of the dead. And Jesus himself was resurrected from death to life out of holy Mount Moriah. And on the third day, when the women came to the tomb, the angel said to them, "He's not here. He is risen." And we are about to celebrate this time of year. These details about the trumpet flowers, signaling that his trumpet call could come in the spring to resurrect the dead, is truly fascinating. And having the crown chrysanthemum on his cheek says to me, the King of Kings is coming back, and he's going to appear. And it could very well be the night he told the disciples to watch, which is right after the Passover Seder, the night of watching. You stay awake and see what God is going to do into the next day. Stay awake, because I'm putting all of these things together that I've talked about, things I've discovered, things that are truly profound revelations that come together, and trying to show you how all of it indicates the time is near. It's hard to believe because we've been waiting for so long, but believe me, we're seeing things that have not happened in 2,000 years' time, and they're about to take place, stampeding quickly. Will all the people that are mega millionaires be led into a strong delusion to support the Sanhedrin, who's got the Antichrist spirit? And then they'll find out that the Sanhedrin had a plan. Some of the rabbis with the Sanhedrin had said that it was their duty to burn down the churches. So this is in the words of the director of the Temple Institute. He's the CEO. Something's coming that they're not going to be prepared for. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed hearing this. Please give a like to help the algorithms to get the video viewed by more and more people. Continue to support this effort. And think of it too that whatever you do is recorded in heaven, that you are a part of it. And we are living this storybook, which ends with us going to be with the King. If you want to donate something, it's paypal.me/KKROCOCO. Or if you want to send something by mail, it's Kimberly K. Ballard, Ballard, P.O. Box 246, Niwot, Niwot. It was an Indian chief. Colorado is CO 80544. If you want to get a copy of my major masterpiece, it's a family heirloom type of book, but it's all about Jesus. It's not about me. I do talk about some of the experiences and miracles that happened along the way, but Dr. Avinoam Dannon's botanical pictures are in my book, and he was such a blessing. He was harassed by other Jews, by the way, for showing anything about that shroud had to do with Jesus. So he paid a price, even though he was, not claiming one thing or another. But deep down, I think he knew his King. And I'll see him again, and I'll be so excited. Well, I'll see you in the next video. I hope this blessed you. Good night.